afternoon. I'm Abby Back, and I'm a member of the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly Education Committee, which is one of the co-sponsors. And we're really happy to be co-sponsoring this event today with the Center for Feminist Resources. And I want to just give some thanks also to Inakshi Dua, who's the director of CFR and has been doing a tremendous amount of work to help support this event. So the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly, or GTWA, is a sort of anti-capitalist work in progress, and one of the things we do is we have these educationals that we call coffee houses. We have a little bit of coffee, but we mostly have a lot of conversation. And there's been a tremendous amount of interest in Marxism and feminism, and also in the political economy of newly industrializing countries, or what are sometimes called the tigers, and have different names, the Global South, the BRICS, and so on. And this film and Reena Kukreja's work really brings that together with a remarkable case study about the role of cross-region marriages in India. And she's an internationally acclaimed documentary filmmaker. Reena, we're really very pleased to be able to have Reena today. She hails from both Kingston, Ontario and Delhi, India, and spends her time in both places. And Reena lectures at Queen's University, where I had the pleasure to meet her, and is also doing a PhD in cultural studies. But she's an internationally acclaimed documentary filmmaker. She's produced over 50 documentaries, and this is her most recent. The films are largely used as educational tools. They're also obviously incredibly entertaining. But this film is really exceptional. It's really unique. I've had the opportunity to see it before, so I thought if we were able to ask Reena to come along, it would be a great opportunity. I'll be passing the mic over to Reena, who's going to be introducing the film for 5-10 minutes. Then the film itself, I think, is an hour, 59 minutes. And then we'll be able to follow with a Q&A, and we'll make some announcements. So it's not only extremely interesting, it's a beautiful piece of artwork and cinematography and music. So, I'm sure you're going to enjoy it and also learn a lot. So please help me to welcome Reena Kukreja.
Well, with such words, it becomes very hard to speak, right? Thank you, Abby, for welcoming me so generously. I'd like to thank Dr. Abigail Bekan and Inakshi Dua from Center for Feminist Resources, York University, and Beth Zatun and Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly for organizing this event. And Abby first for initiating when I said to her, look, I need this as an activist educational thing. We need to spread the word about what's happening and also to dispel certain commonly held notions about the women in such marriages. And so she said, well, let's begin with this and then we can network. So thank you, Abby, for bringing this up. Well, where do I begin? So let me begin with how I started thinking about this film, and then I'll delve into the subject of the film. The thought about doing this film came to me when I was doing research on another documentary, my third last documentary, on migrant women domestic workers in India who were migrating from poorer eastern parts of India to work as full-time live-in domestic workers in urban centers, primarily Delhi and other metropolises. And during the course of my research, what I found was a very disturbing incident that was recurring was a number of parents would meet me and speak about how their daughters had gone missing. Their daughters were not traceable. Some of them, of course, had been were made to work in households, but a few landed up in marriages in certain parts of North India. And coincidentally, what happened was at the same time, I was doing a project evaluation for a research organization, and I landed up in a couple of villages in the North Indian province of Haryana. And during the course of my conversation, I asked people, like the women in a self-help group, so what's new, what's happening in your village? Well, they said, Reena, do you know, there are all these women who are coming from, say, other parts of India and are being brought here and they're getting married. And so this is a newly emerging phenomenon and it's spreading. And very, very interestingly, there was one young woman sitting there and I got to speak to her. I happened to know how to speak Bengali, her native language. And so when she heard me speak, when I asked her name, I knew she was from Bengal. And I spoke to her in Bangla, and she started crying. And she said, it's the first time in 3 years I've heard anyone speak in this language. And so that's what got my interest going. I wanted to learn more. I started doing research on what had been published and what were, various organizations saying about such marriages. What I found was a very disturbing discourse about such marriages. Almost all the women were being projected as trafficked victims, women who had all been coerced. And given my own experience with the few case studies, I felt inclined to say the same. So I began with the premise that I wanted to look at what was happening in the new forms of marriages. Here it's very important to stress, when I talk to audiences within India, they get the transgressive nature of these marriages immediately, because in amongst Hindus and even amongst Muslims, marriages happen amongst caste groups. Caste, and even within caste groups, they are broken down into sub-caste groups. Now, caste groups are geographically bound. You don't go beyond, say, Ontario or Manitoba to fetch a bride. And the caste group, because it's geographically bound, you're also linguistically sharing the same tradition, customs are the same of that same caste group. But what is happening, what is transgressive is, here caste rules are being broken. Because men are traveling from certain parts of North India to go to extreme Eastern India to get brides from different caste groups, ethnicity, geographically different spaces, and bring them home as their brides. Within the context of how marriages happen in India, this is a very problematic thing, because when we talk about intercaste marriage, I'm not talking of these cross-region marriages as transgressive. Intercaste marriages are still not welcome in India at this moment. They are met with extreme violence, rejection, and even death. I mean, just 3 days ago, one of the villages where I had done my primary research in Haryana, a young couple eloped, intercaste, and they were both killed by the girl's parents. Public killing followed by torture. They had the torture, and then their dead bodies were displayed in the village on a tractor as a kind of reminder to all other young people who might want to transgress. So given that context, it becomes very important to situate what I'm doing as research to understand what is happening within India. What are the kind of material changes that are taking place that are leading to these marriages? When I say cross-region marriages, in Canada, and I've given this example several times, people don't think twice about marrying in Quebec, going across Quebec or PEI or British Columbia. In India, it doesn't happen. In certain parts of Southeast Asia, within China, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, brides from poorer parts of China and Vietnam and Philippines are being brought in to meet the female shortage there. Now, the female shortage has been caused because of the whole attitude of girl dispreference, which has been fueled by the new reproductive technologies. And in India, of course, it started with the whole US aid in 1960s, which laid down the condition of family planning, quote unquote. You need to manage your population, and one way you do that is by offering free and open abortions to your women as a family planning tool. And my film will deal with that in some details. So what I do want to point out is that these marriages are extremely non-customary. And to give you an example of how non-customary, I gave you the caste example. Now let me give you another example before I start rolling the film. Is I say, imagine you are born in a lush tropical environment where you have you speak a different language, you move around, you work in the fields, and then you're transported in a desert where there are no trees to look out. You come from a rice-eating family to a fully wheat-eating and a vegetarian family. the language that is spoken is totally different. You feel you've landed up in Mars with no support structure. There are no kin structures there in place. It's extremely hard. So this is the kind of situation that we see. And of course, when we see all of this, we think of women as victims. But what I found during my research, and I researched on this project for 2 years, I traveled over 256 villages. I interviewed 56 plus brides for this project. So it's a pretty huge number of traveling to so many villages and then interviewing so many brides and their husbands and in-laws and community elders. What I found was a far more complex picture than what was being projected in the media by anti-trafficking activists, by NGOs and the government. And so this is what I want to present to you, a more complex tale than what I had encountered in my first visit with the women. So without further ado, let me roll the film to you. First question, when I started doing research on this, I thought I had the answers all bad because the dominant discourse was that there's a shortage of girls because people have practiced sex selection over years, and because of the family planning procedure and the need for a male child, and that there were female rich regions in other parts of India, so let's match them up. But once I started doing the research, I must admit I was very depressed. Even the last time when I went to India, that was for field work last year, I actually came back quite upset about, and I remember, I think I told Abby, like, I have never been struck so hard about how poverty can cripple people, how poverty can create situations where people have no other choices. And I think that's the most important thing that we have to understand is dowry, yes, it's a problem. It never was such a big problem as it has become now. And that's where I want to contextualize these marriages. These marriages did occur historically too. Within Haryana or Rajasthan, or what we call the Greater United Punjab, people from upper castes would go and marry women from lower castes, but they were very small in number. However, since mid-1990s, there has been an exponential leap in these marriages. So what is creating the enabling conditions? What has led to such a large number of these transgressive, non-customary, depressing, as you see very clearly, marriages to take place? And that's where we also have to understand from 1990s, early 1990s onwards, India has witnessed the emergence, it embraced the neoliberal regime with structural adjustment programs. So what it has led to is certain areas of India becoming extremely marginalized. People, communities becoming very poor, disenfranchised, they have been pushed off their lands, deprived of their livelihoods and resources. And that has created a position where they are not able to provide dowry. On the other hand, dowry was not evident across all caste groups and classes. Amongst caste groups too, it was done as a matter of prestige amongst the upper classes of the caste groups. But now with globalization and the spread of consumer economy, you have let's put it this way, you have dishwashers, you have washing machines, you have all consumer products being sold. India, if you look at statistics, if you just Google, is one of the fastest emerging market for luxury goods. And it wasn't rare for me to find washing machines displayed in the front room of what we call one-room shacks in deserts, because these were status symbols. So what you see as dowry is also spurred by the rise in what we call the consumer society. So it's a whole series of complex, interlocked things that are happening. So when you ask that question, where do you begin? Well, I would say it has to be a multi-pronged approach. You cannot just say, let's try and educate people about that the girl and the boy child are equal and that we should respect them equally. I mean, doing that is not going to take away the economic reality that faces certain people. And also the whole patriarchal ideology which hegemonizes people, including the girls. The women that you see here, and also young unmarried women that I talked to, they said, yes, we have to get married. Whether we get married locally or we get married in other region, that is our fate. Marriage has to happen if we want to save our family's honor and we want to keep ourselves intact. So that is so deeply internalized. And again, coupled with that is women's non-access to livelihood resources or inheritance rights. Even though the government has legislated that women should get equal inheritance, unfortunately it doesn't happen in reality. Customs prevent them from getting inheritance. So all of that is a multi-pronged approach. I would first start by saying, let's try and remove the disenfranchisement that is happening to disempowered communities. And we're talking about the lower caste, the lower, the regions. Let's begin with that because that has created a ripe situation for these things to take place. So, yes, you.
I just want to ask a corollary. So, talking about the inheritance, but a lot of the inheritance to women is not going to solve anything because then they become more valuable to abuse. So the inheritance thing doesn't necessarily give a good outcome. It could actually make it worse because they become more valuable.
Right, and that is a catch-22. However, what happens is when you start giving inheritance rights, women get empowered to ask for that. And that, in sense, is something important to send for the community that, yes, men and women are treated equally and that these laws should be applied. And that's where, the caste community leaders come in really, they are very problematic, where they don't want equality to happen. I mean, the caste elders that we saw, they are the ones who dictate, who issue diktats. And in some senses also issue diktats about who should die and who should live if a transgression happens, as intercaste marriage happens. So all of that is there. So feminist groups in India, one of the largest feminist activist organization in India that has a base of 12 million women members, has taken up this issue after the report and the film came out. So they are working actively on creating awareness at the local level. But again, it has to be, I keep on saying it's far more complex. It isn't what I thought it to be. Like when I first started doing this film and the research, my title was, I was bought as a bride. How simplistic could it be? And now it's undergone a major paradigm shift. So yeah, we have to look at the economy, we have to look at the society, we also have to look at patriarchal ideology. And we also have to provide livelihood resources to women too. I mean, and they are totally distinct. I'm talking about whether it's a rural phenomenon. Yes, very rightly so. Right now it is a rural phenomenon, largely because that's where in Haryana, one of the major regions, Haryana, Punjab, Rajasthan, women, rural areas, it's agricultural economy, it's based on farming and on cattle rearing. So cattle rearing and farming, and interestingly, more than 80% of the work is done by the women of the household. It's unpaid, free, productive labor of the females within the households. So if you don't have a young woman in your house, that means that you're not getting free labor to do your agricultural activities and to look after the dairy cattle.
What do the men do?
Well, very good question. The men, according to traditional customary norms that have been set up, only do the most important, quote unquote, most important task of plowing the land. So plowing, or what we call breaking the land for fertilization, is a task that is reserved only for men. No woman can run the plow, if I can use the right English, whatever it is. They cannot plow the land. And again, it's linked to the whole symbolism around fertilization, because land is seen as a virgin fertile territory. So it is the male who is fertilizing it, taking that whole allegory. So men only plow, and then all other tasks are left to the female. Whether we look after planting, whether it's weeding, whether it's harvesting. Then men come in again when it is when the harvesting has happened and the crop has been collected, marketing it. So, plowing and marketing is what they do. Most important, because when they market, they are going to get the money in their hands. So the women who have slogged their butts off, if I can use such a word, don't get the money in their end after all. It's free productive labor. So again, pointing to the urban-rural phenomenon, one of the questions that grappled me and Paritosh, my partner, when we were doing the field work was, at what stage do the men decide that they want to go and get married, right? Is it because they need companionship, whether they need intimacy? And these are Western constructs about, intimacy, companionship, love, so on and so forth. And what we found interestingly was that men said quite openly, and so did other people in the community, that if men want sex, they can go and buy sex, right? So that's not a compelling factor for them. The compelling factor is when they find that other female members in the household are unable to provide for them in terms of their food, in terms of their needs, and when you don't have other women in the household to do chores. That is both productive and reproductive chores. So that's when the decision is taken, yes, okay, let's pull in some money and go and get the bride from elsewhere. Does it extend to the urban economy? That's one area that has been perplexing me, but that's a point for future research. But right now it is a widespread rural phenomenon. I can talk more about it, it's like, at length, and there are certain other things. Coming to the Marriage Act, the government proposed it in India is governed, many of the laws around marriage are governed by customary laws, whether we talk about those Hindus, Muslims. When we talk about the Hindus, it also includes the Sikhs, the Jains, and the Buddhists as well. The Muslims have their own laws around marriage, and so do the Christians. So what has been proposed is that we have a uniform law governing the registration of marriages and deaths. That's what it's termed. A lot of activists have been campaigning for it. It was proposed in the parliament in 2012, and if I remember correctly, just earlier this month, it was passed in the upper house of Indian Parliament. It still has to become an act. Whether it would give rights and whether registration of marriages is common. Registration of marriages is not common at all. It's people like me or someone else who go and get their marriages registered if they want to make a statement against traditional marriages, right? Or if they want to migrate, that's when you need for your visas, a marriage certificate. So it's not commonplace. Even urban educated women don't ask for it, even though it would give them equal rights. It would give them far more legal rights vis-a-vis marriage, divorce, maintenance, and custody of the children. So they don't do it. They think, yeah, let's take, the walk around the fire for, 7 times and that's it. Now, if this thing becomes an act and it gets implemented, at least what would happen is, and what I have given in my recommendation is that very much like asking for stressing the importance of a birth certificate. Now, if you go to any village, 10 years ago, birth certificates were not commonplace. Now they are. It's a rule. You have to have a birth certificate. We could do the same with a marriage certificate. Now, why would that become important? It would immediately weed out bogus marriages, where fraudulent people or traffickers or marriage agents create these sham marriages. It would also deter conjugal or the husband's family or the husband from abusing the woman. Because then she could very well go to the local police station and say, look, I got married and this is what it is and this is my paper and I want rights. Mm-hmm. So all of that is important because these are communities that have land. And the woman can ask for her share in the land for her children. Because now what happens is, if the marriage breaks down, if the husband decides or his family decides, which is what is happening, property is the biggest bone of contention. Many of the marriages that are taking place, the other family members are abusing the women, exploiting them, torturing them, because they want them to run away. They don't want the family property to be divided further. If one male member remains unmarried, that means that his share would pass on to other members in the family. So it's also linked to property as well. So Marriage Act would give women a lot of rights and protection. But it needs a lot of work right now. It still is not an act that has been implemented, but at least it's been passed in one house of the parliament. It has to be passed by another, and then it would get ratified by the president. And it's a federal thing, so we don't have to go to all the other provinces. The question of how many children, there was another question that I don't think I wrote down properly. I've just written barriers.
I wanted to know how many children on average these families have, because
right.
Why do they have that many?
Right.
They can have more than one child.
Mm-hmm. Now, in India, when the family planning thing became the norm, we began with a two-child norm. Two-child norm is what is there. So if you breach that, now what has happened is that you will be denied promotions and positions in government offices. You cannot stand for elections. And that it's not retroactive. It's now currently enforced from as of a certain period. So you cannot. So it really disbars you if you have more than 2 children. How many children do people traditionally have when they have access to reproductive clinics like these, ultrasound clinics? Normally what I found was, in my survey, I had asked a question, how many children do you have and how many boys and girls and what is the age? So we would determine, like, is the girl child older or younger? What I found interestingly was that, and talking to community members, was that when the woman becomes pregnant for the first time, they say, let any child of any sex be born, boy or girl. So quite often, the first child, if it's a girl, is allowed to be born. It's only if the first child is a girl, that's when people who have access to resources, when I'm talking of resources, it's money, they then go in for ultrasound to determine the sex of the child, because they don't want another girl child. Why do they allow the first child as a girl to be born? Because there is this belief amongst the Hindus that when you give away, during the time of marriage, you are conducting, how do I say it in English? You are committing the greatest act of charity by donating your daughter to another family. So you are earning a bigger reward in heaven, right? So everyone says, yep, it's okay, you're earning that reward, but you don't want to do it for the second one because you're not getting anything out of it, right? You're only going to get indebted. So the second child is when the sex is determined. And obviously that's when the abortions happen. Poverty, sex-selective abortions, it usually takes place amongst high income. In the urban areas, yes, that is what we have seen. Various surveys have come up with the fact that in urban policies like Delhi, primarily it is the high income, highly educated professional areas are the ones that have the highest degree of sex selective abortions. However, we also have to understand such kind of values about male preference have also percolated and spread. So people use these upper class people as an example. Hey, look, Reena is doing it, so why can't we? I mean, Reena is a professional who's teaching in a university, and if she can do it, like, come on, it's used as a way of legitimizing. But also we have to understand the market economics makes it affordable to people. You have to understand the sheer number makes it profitable. You don't have to have a sex test done which will cost you $2,000, because if you do that, then you're limiting the number of clients who are going to come to you. So you make it very affordable. You make it affordable, you make it $100. You know your market. You know how much your market is going to pay, and that's where I say it's all market economy. The doctors have bought, and here even the companies that make these ultrasound machines are totally in the whole know of it. They know that such a large number of machines are being bought by doctors in Haryana or Rajasthan or Punjab, and they're not even registering them. But they want it because they want their profit. And they know where they're going. So these doctors set up what we call mobile clinics, mobile ultrasound clinics, where at the back of the car, they put this ultrasound thingy, they go around in the back roads. And all you have to do is give them a certain sum, and so it happens. What has been disturbingly found is that the cheaper it's getting, the more accessible it is becoming. And doctors are seeing the profit motive in driving down the price. The more you lower the price, the more clients you're going to get, the more the number of people are going to benefit. So it's not something that is now only used by upper class, high income families. It's now being used by everyone. And the latest survey of India, Census of India 2012, 11 was very, very disturbing. Regions that actually had never practiced sex selective abortions now have witnessed a sharp drop in the number of girls in the 0 to 6 category, 0 to 6 years category, because we're going to map it over several decades to actually see what happens, because even if the number of girls in 0 to 6 category may be positive, but because of girl-child neglect, by the time 10 or 11 years comes, there is a significant drop. So that's something that's there as well. Talking about how do these values about girl dispreference transpose across various regions. And here I would not like to just point fingers only at the Indian community. It's pervasive almost everywhere. Whether I look at Southeast Asia, whether I look at Latin America, that whole masculinity thing is very pervasive. So, and of course, to assume that if someone crosses a geographical boundary, they are going to leave their embedded ideological beliefs behind is a problematic thing. So it does carry over with them, and you have seen a couple of studies that did come out in Canada that talked about how within the Chinese Canadian communities as well as the South Asian communities here, there is a significant difference amongst the number of boys and girls born. So I'm not surprised by that, as much as the whole incidence of the male attitude that carries over. Talking about women and the implications, the long-term implications, health implications for women. And here I'd like to say, it's very interesting to be asked this question in this context, because it is the West that imposed it on India and other countries of the global South. Whereas here we talk about reproductive rights. For women, we are concerned about the rights of women. Over there, it is perfectly okay for a woman to get abortions 14 times, 16 times, because it is used as a way of family planning. And that's what it's also linked to donor aid. So when we talk about the health of the women there, we have to talk about whose health are we talking about? Which group of women's health are we talking about? We're talking about women who actually have no choice. Because if they have children, their husbands are going to be denied opportunities of employment. Healthcare system, because of neoliberal regime, is collapsing. There's almost non-existent public healthcare system. So we have to understand what has led to this crisis. Long-term health implications, of course, it creates problems. Are we concerned about it? Depends who we are talking to and which constituency we are talking from, right? So, yes, as a feminist activist who works in South Asia, I'm very concerned about it. But when I come here, I have to phrase it very carefully because it is taken up by pro-life people. Because then they say, hey, you know, we are snuffing out so many lives. And within India too, it's becoming a problem. So it's a very tricky terrain that I find myself traversing, and many other feminist activists too. Health of any woman, birth control, yes. Talking about what happens when the first child is a boy, I would come to that. When a child now, interestingly, I found out if the first child is a boy, most families voluntarily opt for sterilization, which is very, very interesting. Rural communities, everyone knows about all of this because the government of India has been very proactive in spreading this whole message about various methods to control your family. Now it's family planning, it's essentially controlling the population.
They're not concerned like if you only have one child, if the child becomes sick and die, like they wouldn't have...
Not necessarily, no. Because they do want to give their child the best of opportunities. And if it's a male child, you want to give him the best of health and education, so on and so forth. So, coming back to whether the caste system has been done away with, no, of course not. It's not been done away. I mean, we should not assume... It's something that emerged historically, socially, to maintain hierarchies, to exploit certain groups of people. And these unequal, highly exploitative hierarchies still continue in India because upper castes benefit from them.
Is it illegal?
Yes, it is illegal, but there are so many things that are illegal on paper but still happen, right? Very much like, say, we say domestic violence is illegal, still it happens. Rape is illegal, it still happens. Caste system is such, I would say it is a part of the fabric of Indian society. And we have to bring about a major attitudinal shift, and that won't happen because, to my students I always say, let's go back to physics and the law of resistance. People have been used to enjoying power for a long time, and suddenly come up these lower caste groups who are called Dalits, and they are opposing their exploitation, their historical exploitation and marginalization. There is resistance, equal and opposite resistance, and that's why you see the violence that is happening to Dalits or the lower caste groups. And coming back to again to the question that Paul asked about, like, you know, there's a lot of awareness about violence, sexual violence. There's a lot of activism that is emerging. Interestingly, what is being seen in India is that all this discourse only emerged when violence happened to a young woman in the urban metropolis who was educated. On an everyday basis in India, there is violence that happens to lower caste Dalit women in rural areas. And not just now, it has happened historically, it has happened post-independence India on an everyday basis. You just type in Dalit women violence and it'll come up. It is seen as the norm, the way you enforce power, you maintain your superordinate status. And women are used as a tool. Nobody raises the English electronic media, which has been very responsible in creating this kind of a moral outrage, and here I'm using these words very carefully. This moral outrage is quite largely silent when a young Dalit woman is raped, gang raped by upper caste men, and is then cut up in pieces. They don't talk about that. It's the Dalit activists who talk about that, or other human rights groups. But moral outrage of the society is raised up when a young woman had gone to see Life of Pi, an English film, at a shopping mall. Or recently in Mumbai, a young photographer, a professional photographer who was on a photographic assignment was then gang raped. So the whole country uprose in rebellion. Like, what country are we talking about? It's only small pockets of urban areas that are rising in rebellion. So we have to look at sexual violence is highly divided. If it happens to a poor low-caste woman, so be it, that's her lot. 8-year-old, I have met so many young women, young girls, slightly older than my own daughter, 7-8-year girls who have been sexually assaulted and abused by upper caste men. They see it as a part of their life, that this is their lot, that they will be abused. And statistics are quite damning, let me tell you that. Talking about film and how is it being used, am I right on that question? Have I answered almost everything? Okay, so it's a good question to finish on, and I'll come to, okay, so actually I'll finish on that later, but let me talk about our own experience. So Paritosh, myself, and Amba, we started doing this field work. It was very interesting for us. Paritosh and I have an intercaste, interreligion marriage. Paritosh is from Bihar. The community, he comes from that same community of people who are ostracized and ridiculed and looked down upon. You know, is that whole internal racism. So he is the internal other, right? And I come from a community which is looked upon very highly. I'm a Punjabi by heritage, so I am looked upon with a lot of privilege, and I also have what is called the color privilege. Within India, there is, as much as in other communities, shades of difference upon your color. So if you're lighter skinned, you're more privileged. If you're darker skinned, you're seen as belonging to a lower caste. You don't often find marriage partners. You also have social, you don't have the same social standing. And it's a bit different for both men and women. So I also have what is called the color privilege vis-a-vis my husband and my child, who are darker skinned. So they are the internal other also because of their dark skin, right? So the internal other, remember, he's the other caste. He's also from another community. Tell me when it becomes uncomfortable for you, Paritosh. So what was very interesting was for the brides, it was amazing that when we would mention about Paritosh being from Bihar and our child being an intercaste, child, even though she's adopted, and she's darker skinned, so women would open up because they said, you understand what it means from where we are coming up. So it allowed them to speak more openly. For their families back home, it also allowed them to open up because they felt that we could understand the agony. Quite often they would tell me, when they were talking about how problematic it was to get their dark-skinned daughter married off, because the dowry demand for a dark-skinned daughter is much higher than a lighter-skinned girl. So they would say, Reena, you know what we mean, you understand it because you have a daughter who's dark-skinned. You're going to face problems, you know what it is. So it allowed them to create a solidarity in terms of understanding, in terms of our shared pain that I might face later on when I want to quote-unquote settle my daughter. So, and for Paritosh as a male, as an internal other, we would use it sometimes quite strategically as well. So when people would, the caste elders would talk about like, the Biharis are like this, that and the other. So Paritosh would say, well, actually I'm also from Bihar. So there'd be a kind of a stunned silence. They wouldn't know what to say. And then would come out like, okay, yeah, but you're not like them. So that would allow Paritosh and me to start talking about, so who are them within the Biharis? If he is not the internal other, then who do we construct as the internal other, as the savage Bihari? Right? So we used our multiple identities to create dialogues as well and to disrupt certain dominant narratives. And to end on, and I know I've gone beyond 10 minutes, is how is the film and the report being used? It's not just the English version, I've also made the Hindi version of this film. So And whilst I was there in India, I showed it extensively to a lot of research organizations, activist organizations, feminist groups, educational institutions, higher educational institutions. The report recommendations have been passed on to a large number of bodies. So one of the recommendations was about the status of the mental health of the women. Many of them are suicidal, they have depression. And I had said that, as a recommendation, we had proposed that this should be taken up as an area of research. So one of the leading postgraduate institutes on medical research has taken up this issue. Because I am not a doctor, right? Nor am I a psychologist, so I can't do that. So certain recommendations are being picked up. What is very heartening is, as I mentioned in the beginning, was one of the feminist organizations, All India Democratic Women's Organization. It's a left-leaning group with a very active base of 12 million women across 23 provinces. So they've taken up this issue of a grassroots awareness, using it in workshops to start a dialogue, particularly in the conjugal regions of Haryana and Rajasthan, to start a dialogue amongst the women cadre from those areas. Now, it's also led to a lot of media coverage and disrupted the dominant narrative that all women are trafficked, right? So in some senses, and I need to work more proactively on that, primarily because the dominant discourse is that all these women are trafficked. It's only a small percentage of women who are trafficked. But because the aid of the anti-trafficking NGOs comes from European Union or from INGOs or from organizations in the US, it comes with strings attached, and certain words are more preferred. I mean, the rescue syndrome and saving the brown woman from the native male violence still continues, even though, we find it very problematic. So it reinforces that, and so it's very easy to give funding to organizations which are saying, look, these women are victims of these they are sexual slaves of these savage male monsters. So, and that's not true. We found men who were caring about their women, who went out of their way to accommodate their women's wishes of wanting rice or wanting certain things. And within the constraints of the marriage, there were intimacies being created too, and negotiations happening as well. So we have to recognize that not all men are monsters, and if they are monsters, they have been created because of the social condition. So, and so at least the film has allowed, and the report has allowed that dialogue to start taking place. And I think that's critical too, even when we have you all come here. Now, some of the women are literate. They can be functionally literate, but the majority are not. And the same holds true for men also. However, functional literacy should not be held as a weapon against them not recognizing their rights. Everyone knows how important their vote is. Everyone now knows that birth certificate is necessary. So when you start creating awareness, everyone then women would understand the value of registered marriage. Interestingly, just to end on that note, amongst the Muslims, you saw one of the religious leaders of the Muslims who has been very active in proposing for marriages to be registered. The Muslim women are very aware, whether they are illiterate, whether they are facing a lot of domestic abuse. They keep one copy of their marriage certificate with their parents. And when I asked, why do you keep it with your parents? They say, here it can be taken and destroyed, but with our parents, it's there for safekeeping. If something goes wrong, our parents can file a report there with the police and take it to the court. So, illiteracy should not be seen as a way of denying justice and rights. So,
thank you very much.